The morning of my parents' 30th anniversary, my mother made French toast with powdered sugar and cut my sisters into little triangles the way she always had, even though my sister was 28 years old and perfectly capable of cutting her own food. She set my plate down without looking at me. That should have told me everything. We'd driven 4 hours from Columbus to their house in Dayton because my mother had called in that particular voice she used when she wanted something soft and slightly wounded, like she was already disappointed in you before you'd even had a chance to say no. She said she wanted the whole family together for the milestone. She said it was important. She said family is everything, you know that. I knew better than to argue. I always had. My name is Stella. I'm 31 years old, and I spent most of my life being the practical one, the responsible one, the one who figured things out quietly while my younger sister Celeste was handed every soft landing our parents could build. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it the way you state a fact about weather. It was cold for a long time. It was cold for years. Celeste is 3 years younger than me and has never once paid her own rent. Not because she couldn't. She has a degree. She has a job at a marketing firm, but because our parents have always stepped in before she had to. They co-signed her car. They covered her security deposit twice. They paid off one credit card I only heard about by accident when my mother left a bank statement on the kitchen counter and I saw the amount before I could look away. My father used to say I was the strong one. He meant it as a compliment. I understood eventually that it was actually just permission to give me less. Dinner that anniversary night was pot roast, my mother's specialty, and the table was set with the good china that only came out for Celeste's birthday and Christmas. My father made a toast. He talked about 30 years of marriage, about building something real, about legacy. He looked at my mother when he said it, and then he looked at Celeste, and then, briefly, at the wall behind my head. After dessert, my mother disappeared into the bedroom and came back with 2 envelopes. She set them on the table side by side. "We want to celebrate with you both," she said. "We've been planning something special." Celeste's envelope was thick. Mine was thin. I noticed before I touched them. Celeste opened hers first. It was a check for $14,000 enough, my mother explained, for Celeste to finally take that interior design certification program she'd been talking about, plus cover her rent for the 6 months it would take to complete it full-time. My mother had already looked up the program. She had the brochure. She had a list of apartments near the school. Then I opened mine. It was a card, cream-colored, with a watercolor flower on the front. Inside, my parents had written the note about how proud they were of me and how they knew I didn't need help because I'd always been so capable. Folded inside was a gift card to a home goods store. $60. I sat with it in my hands for a moment. The paper was slightly stiff. The ink on my mother's handwriting was the same careful cursive she used for grocery lists. My father said, "You've always been so independent, Stell. We didn't want to insult you by assuming you needed anything." My sister said nothing. She was already taking a photo of the check for her Instagram. I drove home that night with 4 hours of highway and an AM station playing old country music because I didn't trust myself to choose anything else. I thought about the word capable. I thought about how, 3 years earlier, when my car needed a new transmission and I was between jobs for 6 weeks, I had asked my parents for a loan, not a gift. A loan, with a repayment plan I typed up on a spreadsheet, and my father had said they were a little tight right now. 2 weeks later, Celeste got a new laptop. I didn't cry on that drive home. I was past the crying stage by then. I was in a different stage, one that doesn't have a clean name but feels like finally seeing a shape you've been staring at for years without being able to make it out. I was an accountant, had been for 6 years, first at a mid-sized firm and then, for the last 2, on my own with a small client list I'd built from referrals. I was careful with money because I had learned early that there was no net beneath me. I had a savings account I funded like a religion. I had a Roth IRA. I had a 6-month emergency fund in a high-yield account. I had all of these things because the alternative was the kind of freefall I'd watched my sister get caught from over and over, and I knew no one would catch me. 2 weeks after the anniversary dinner, I got a new client, a retired engineer named Mr. Okafor who'd been referred by someone in my existing network. He needed help organizing years of investment records and preparing for a significant asset transfer to his adult children. He was meticulous, slightly formal, and genuinely kind in the way that some people are who've lived long enough to stop performing it. Working through his records, I found a small discrepancy in some paperwork filed on his behalf years earlier by a previous accountant. It was minor on its face, a clerical error in how a particular trust instrument had been recorded. But when I pulled the thread, I found something neither of us expected. Mr. Okafor had a small-cap technology stock he purchased decades ago, almost as an afterthought, that had since been absorbed into a larger acquisition, and then another and another in a chain of corporate events that his old accountant had never properly tracked or reported. The position had been dormant in his records, unlisted, but it existed. It was real, and under the terms of a class action settlement finalized the previous year involving securities fraud at one of those parent companies, there was a claimant fund. He was entitled to a portion, a significant one. I spent 3 weeks filing the claim, verifying documentation, and corresponding with the settlement administrator. It was the most complicated paperwork I'd done in years, but I did it carefully the way I did everything because that's the only way I know how to work. The claim was approved. Mr. Okafor was a generous man. He said I had given him back something he didn't know he'd lost, and that he didn't know how to price that. We agreed on a fee arrangement, and he insisted it be above my standard rate. The check he wrote me covered 14 months of my income. I deposited it on a Thursday. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for a while after. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my mother. I didn't tell her about the money. I asked her if she and my father would like to come to Columbus for dinner the following weekend, that I wanted to do something nice for them. She sounded pleasantly surprised. She said, of course, and she said it warmly, in a way that made me feel 8 years old again in the best and worst possible sense. I made reservations at a restaurant I liked, not flashy, not a statement, just genuinely good food in a place with good lighting and cloth napkins. I told my sister when she texted asking what was happening. She said she'd come too. Dinner was pleasant on the surface. My father talked about a home repair project. My mother asked about my work in the careful, slightly incurious way she always had. Celeste talked mostly about herself, which was its natural state. Near the end, my mother patted my hand across the table and said, "You know, Stella, you're doing so well. You really don't need us the way Celeste does. You never have." I looked at her. I held her gaze for a moment. "I know," I said. "I just wanted you to see that." I paid the check before anyone could reach for it. On the drive home, Celeste called me. She said Mom and Dad seemed a little quiet after I left. She asked if I was okay. I said I was better than okay. I said I'd figured something out. She said, "What?" I said that I've been waiting for permission my whole life. I'm not doing that anymore. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "What does that mean?" I didn't explain, not yet. What it meant, concretely, was this. I had enough money to do something I'd been circling for 2 years without letting myself fully want it. I had a client I'd lost to a larger firm the previous year who had called me recently saying they wanted to come back. I had 2 other small businesses in my network who had asked, separately, whether I'd ever considered taking on a small business advisory role, not just tax prep and bookkeeping, but actual financial planning. I had skills that had been quietly compounding the same way that stock had been, in the background, unrecorded, real. I spent the next 4 months building. I incorporated my practice under a proper LLC. I hired a part-time assistant, a woman named Priya, who was finishing her accounting degree and was sharper than most people I'd worked with, twice her age. I moved to a better office space in a building with other small professional firms and good natural light. I updated my website. I started sending a monthly newsletter to my client list with practical financial tips, nothing flashy, just useful, the kind of content I would have wanted when I was 24 and terrified of making a wrong money move. I did not tell my parents any of this. I did not post about it publicly. I kept it quiet the way I had kept most of my life quiet, but this time it wasn't from shame or smallness. It was because I was building something real and I didn't want the noise. By the end of that first year under the new structure, my revenue had grown enough that I reclassified myself from sole proprietor to S-Corp. My accountant. Yes, I had hired my own accountant, someone I trusted to look at my books with the same eye I used for everyone else's, told me I'd had a strong year. She said it flatly the way accountants do, but she smiled when she said it. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone all those months ago. You really don't need us. She was right. She had just never understood what that actually cost me to become. The call came on a Wednesday morning in November while I was in the middle of reviewing a client's quarterly report. My mother's voice was different, thinner. She said she needed to talk to me about something, that it was important, that she'd rather do it in person, but she didn't know when that could happen. I asked her to just tell me. She told me. My father had been managing a side investment account for the past several years, one neither she nor Celeste had known about. She'd found out because a letter had arrived from a brokerage firm, and when she'd called the number on the letterhead, they'd confirmed the account existed and that it had performed poorly, very poorly, and that there had been a margin call that my father had tried to cover by taking a second mortgage on the house without telling her. The house had 60% equity when they'd bought it. Now it had 12%. My father had been trying to make enough to retire comfortably without worrying my mother. He had not consulted a professional. He had found a financial influencer online, my mother used that word, with a kind of dazed unfamiliarity, like she'd learned it phonetically and had followed his strategies for 18 months. He had lost a significant amount of money. He was 63 years old and he was going to have to keep working, possibly for many more years. And he was ashamed, and he had not told my mother until the second mortgage letter arrived. My mother cried on the phone. She said she didn't know what to do. She said they might have to sell the house. She said Celeste was upset, and that Celeste's own finances weren't in a position where she could help. And then she paused just long enough that I understood what was coming next. She said, "Stella, you've always been so good with money." I held the phone and looked out my office window at the gray November sky. A pigeon was sitting on the ledge outside. It looked extremely unbothered. I thought about the anniversary dinner, the thin envelope, the $60 gift card, the words "you don't need us" delivered like they were a compliment, like not needing was the same as not being worth anything. I thought about the spreadsheet I'd made when I needed that car loan, the column labeled repayment schedule, the column labeled interest, 0. The way my father had said we're a little tight right now and then, I'd seen the laptop receipt 2 weeks later on the counter. I said, "Mom, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this." She made a sound that meant she was waiting for more. I said, "I think the first step is sitting down with a certified financial planner. Not me, I do accounting, not financial planning, but I can give you 3 names of people I trust and respect, and I'll help you understand what they tell you." She said, "We were hoping." I said, "I know what you were hoping. I'm not able to give you money directly, but I can help you find the right people and I can sit in on those meetings with you if you want. I can translate the jargon. I can tell you if someone is trying to sell you something versus actually helping you. That's what I can do." There was a long pause. She said, "So you won't help us?" I said, "I just told you how I'll help you. That's the help I can give." Celeste called me that evening. Her tone was different from our mother's, less plaintive, more pointed. She said she couldn't believe I was being like this. She said we were family. She said some version of "you've always had it easier" that almost made me laugh, except that it didn't, because it hurt in a very specific and familiar place. I let her finish. Then I said, "Celeste, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." She said, "Okay." I said, "Do you actually believe I've had it easier? Or do you believe that because it was easier for you to believe that than to notice what was actually happening?" Silence. I said, "I'm not trying to fight with you. I genuinely want to know." More silence. And then quietly she said, "I don't know." That was more honesty than I had expected. It cracked something in me, just slightly, in the way that small, honest moments can. I said, I'm going to help Mom and Dad. I'm going to help them find someone good, and I'm going to make sure they don't get taken advantage of again, and I'm going to sit in those rooms and ask the hard questions they don't know how to ask. That's real help. That's the kind of help that actually addresses what happened. She said, what about the house? I said, if it comes to that, there are options. A reverse mortgage isn't right for them, but there are things they can do. It's not over. It just looks bad right now because nobody looked at it honestly until now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you know a lot about this stuff. I said, I know. I had to. I spent the next several weeks doing what I said I would do. I reached out to 2 financial planners in the Dayton area whose work I knew well. I arranged a meeting with my parents and sat at that kitchen table, the same one where the anniversary dinner had happened, where the 2 envelopes had sat side by side, and I asked questions and took notes and explained things in plain language until both of my parents understood what they were looking at. It was not good news entirely. My father was going to have to work until 67 at minimum. The house was not going to be sold, but refinancing was necessary, and the terms were not favorable, and there were years of careful budgeting ahead. My mother cried again at the kitchen table. My father sat with his hands folded and did not say much. He was a proud man who had made a bad decision because he was afraid, and being afraid had cost him. At one point, he looked at me and said, I should have come to you. I said, yes. He said, I didn't want you to know we were struggling. I said I would have helped you then too, without judging you. He didn't say anything else. He looked at the table. I drove home again on that same highway, 4 hours, different season. The corn was harvested and the fields were flat and brown, and the sky was enormous. I had a thermos of coffee and a podcast I'd been meaning to listen to about the early history of the Federal Reserve, which sounds like a strange thing to find comforting, but I did. I thought about capability. I thought about how long I had believed that being capable meant I was supposed to ask for less, need less, require less, how I had accepted that as a fair deal without ever agreeing to it. I thought about the moment at dinner, months earlier, when I had said I know and paid the check. The look on my mother's face, which was not quite comprehension, but was at least the beginning of it. I thought about Celeste saying I don't know in that quiet voice. It was not an apology. It was not nothing. The fields went past in the dark. The coffee was good. My practice is doing well, better than well last quarter. I brought on 2 new small business clients, and I've started running a free monthly financial literacy workshop for first-generation college students at a community center near my office, which is something I designed myself based on what I wish someone had sat down and told me at 22. Priya helps me run it. She's graduating in the spring, and I've already told her there's a full-time position if she wants it. My parents come to Columbus sometimes. My mother has learned to call before assuming I'm free, which is a small thing, but not nothing. My father takes the coffee I make without commenting on the brand, which is different from what he drinks and which, in an earlier version of our relationship, would have prompted a 10-minute discussion. We are learning a different language with each other. It is slow. It is imperfect. Celeste and I had one real conversation a few months ago at a coffee shop halfway between our cities. She told me she'd been thinking about what I'd said. She told me she had started seeing a therapist, partially because of some things the conversation had surfaced in her about our family dynamic. She didn't frame it as an apology. I didn't ask her to. I told her I was glad. I meant it. She asked me, at one point, whether I was angry. Whether I had been angry all those years. I thought about it honestly. I said I think I was sad more than angry. I think I grieved something that was never going to happen and kept expecting it anyway. That's exhausting in a way that's different from anger. She nodded slowly. She said, I think I benefited from not seeing what was happening. I don't know what to do with that. I said, you don't have to do anything with it today. Just knowing it is enough for now. The thing about being capable, actually capable, not just assigned that role before you'd earned it, is that it changes shape over time. It stops being a wall between you and everyone else and starts being something you carry differently, more lightly, because you chose it rather than had it handed to you as a consolation prize. I don't need my parents to have been different. I don't need a rewrite of the anniversary dinner or the car transmission or the 2 envelopes on the good china table. What happened made me precise. It made me thorough. It made me someone who reads the fine print on every document because I learned early that no one was going to read it for me. Some things you build in the dark, without applause, without anyone noticing, and then one day you're standing in a well-lit office with good coffee and a real client list and a part-time employee who calls you when she has a question and expects that you will have an answer. And you do? You always do. That's not luck. That's compound interest on every quiet year you kept going anyway. There's a version of this story where I stay angry, where I use everything that happened as fuel for bitterness and let it quietly burn through all the good things I was trying to build. I understand that version. I spent some time living in it. But here's what I actually learned. Not as a neat lesson, but as something I came to slowly, the way you come to understand a place after you've lived there long enough to stop being a tourist in it. The consequences in my life, the hard ones, the formative ones, were not random. My father lost money because he made decisions from fear and pride, without honesty, without asking for help from someone who actually understood the terrain. That's not bad luck. That's a direct line between a choice and its outcome. He bypassed the hard work of financial literacy and trusted a stranger on the internet because it felt easier than admitting he didn't know enough. The result was a second mortgage and years of recovery. That's how it works. Not as punishment, just as math. And my own path. The Roth IRA opened at 24, the client I took seriously when no one would have noticed if I hadn't. The claim I filed for Mr. Okafor across 3 weeks of paperwork that could have been someone else's problem. That wasn't luck either. I did right by people because it was the right thing to do, and doing right by people consistently, over time, compounds the same way interest does. You don't see it building, you just wake up one day and it's there. I used to think being capable was a burden I'd been assigned. What I understand now is that it's something I earned, quietly, without witnesses, over years of choosing to be honest when I could have cut corners and thorough when no one was checking. That's the part they couldn't give Celeste with a $14,000 check. You can't write a check for integrity. It doesn't arrive in an envelope. What I wish I had understood earlier, and what I'd say to anyone who sees themselves in any part of this, is that the 3 things that actually move your life forward have nothing to do with who your family favors. They're not given, they're built. The first is your character, showing up honestly, doing what you said you'd do, being the same person whether or not anyone is watching. The second is your judgment, training yourself to think clearly, to read a situation accurately, to ask the right questions instead of the comfortable ones. The third is your capacity to keep going, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, through the years when no one is applauding and the progress is invisible. Stella didn't win because something fell into her lap. She won because she never stopped working on those 3 things, even when the people who were supposed to see her were looking somewhere else. The help I gave my parents in the end was real, not because I owed it to them and not out of resentment, but because it was the right thing to do with what I'd built. That distinction matters to me. I didn't help them out of obligation. I helped them because I had become someone who could, and choosing not to would have made me smaller. That's the whole story, I think. Not that I became successful, that I became someone I actually respect.